Hello. I'm Satvik, and I get that the title of the video and my hair combined might make it look like I'm trying to sell you drugs, but I'm not. It's just an offer. Would you like to watch a movie?
These high school boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently, they dance. Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement. Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
This was a trailer for Reefer Madness, which is a 1936 classic, an absolute banger, if I may. It was funded entirely by this church group that wanted to create a moral tale for parents to show them what would happen if their children smoked the devil's lettuce. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like this movie does not make some incredible points. Okay, so here's an example. I don't want to come off as too cool, but I have smoked the devil's lettuce. I have blown the devil's cucumber. The first time I tried it, its effect was sudden, violent, uncontrollable laughter, as, all of us fellow potheads have experienced. And then came dangerous hallucinations. Space expanded. Time slowed down so much that it felt like it was standing still. Fixed ideas came next, conjuring up monstrous extravagances. That was followed by emotional disturbances, the total inability to direct thoughts, and the loss of all power to physical emotions. And as much as it pains for me to say this, the final result was I ended up burning a police station in Chauri Chaura, and after that, Gandhiji had to withdraw the non-cooperation movement. The second time I tried weed, I killed someone with a stick.
Take it easy, kid. I just want to talk to you.
Okay, so for some historical context, this movie came out in 1936 when America was going through the Great Depression. America's privileged, upper class, white, educated classes, they saw their wealth being eroded and they wanted something to blame. And of course, since 4chan is the most accurate representation of American society, they ended up blaming the Mexicans, the blacks, the Hindus. Hindu was anyone who came from India. It wasn't restricted to a religion. Khatre mein sab the. For white, upper class, educated people, the Mexicans, the blacks, and the Hindus were the direct opposite of what they had in society. They were lower class, they were underprivileged, they were largely illiterate. A lot of them could have been illegal immigrants, especially if they were Mexicans or Indians at that time. A lot of people in Mexican and black communities, especially the extremely poverty-struck ones, they were also chads, they were also Sigma enjoyers of the devil's lettuce. And white incel cringe Americans just could not handle it. So their hatred towards these chads extended into the substance that they were using. 85 years after the release of Reefer Madness, another country was going through what America had went through at that time. The country's GDP was seeing a dip that many would call historic. The country's upper classes had this growing resentment against some of the most marginalized people in that country. Farmers, religious minorities, students. And amidst similar socio-economic political conditions, India had her own Reefer Madness moment.
The probe is getting bigger.
बहुत कुछ और निकलने वाला है.
उनको पनिश कीजिए.
The probe is getting bigger.
बहुत कुछ और निकलने वाला है. बहुत कुछ और निकलने वाला है. Do you understand?
chedumal drug वाले.
Ananya Pandey is at the NCB office.
The probe is getting bigger.
The Narcotics Control Bureau has issued summons to actors Deepika Padukone, Sara Ali Khan and Shraddha Kapoor.
नारकोटिक्स कंट्रोल ब्यूरो ने आज बॉलीवुड में ड्रग की जांच के मामले में फिल्म अभिनेता अर्जुन रामपाल के घर की तलाशी ली है.
Karishma Prakash, Deepika Padukone's manager, has now been summoned by the Narcotics Control Bureau.
The probe is getting bigger. The probe is getting bigger. The probe is getting bigger.
What happened? The Gregorian calendar, which the entire world follows, splits time itself into two different categories. Before this whole Jesus thing happened, all of that time was before Christ, and after that, the world entered into the year of the Lord, Anno Domini. The conversation on drugs in India was pretty mild, limited to lawyers and other professionals and the occasional movie or two. But that was before a very successful Bollywood actor committed suicide. And then the conversation on drugs in India entered into the year of the Lord. Jesus Christ was a lean brown man who was killed and then sort of showed up a few days later. This successful actor was a lean brown dude who died. Twitter still wants him to come back. The image of Jesus Christ has been tarnished. His name has been used to do a lot of shady shit. The image of this Bollywood actor has also been tarnished. His name has also been used to gloss over a lot of shady shit. When this actor passed away, a lot of reporters took it upon themselves to prove that he had been murdered, prove that depression and suicide are just myths, and to avenge his death in some weird way. The news story spiraled in very different directions until it was nationally agreed upon that drugs were somehow responsible for his death. In particular, weed was responsible for his death. In particular, the weed that he had been forced into smoking by his girlfriend. This shit show further spiraled into national agencies going after an alleged network of drug criminals in Bollywood.
Why is Deepika Padukone into drugs? Why is Deepika Padukone into drugs?
Everyone on the panel.
You tell me, Shoaib, why is Deepika Padukone into drugs?
Have you tried talking to this guy sober? I won't point to any particular problem with hounding celebrities. I think they're too rich to complain about it, and it's like a nice little gladiator sport that the nation gets to enjoy every once in a while. But imagine being an addict or someone just struggling on their path to recovery. Someone normal without billions of rupees in your bank account. How are you likely to react? How paranoid are you going to get? Around the world, there's this ongoing effort of looking at all forms of addiction as a mental health issue instead of something that is a flaw in the person's character. You could be addicted to shopping, cocaine, sex, or running, and it does not help if you look at the addict as someone who has a flaw in their life that you won't. Superiority does not work here. We have tried throwing addicts in jail. We have tried making addicts feel guilty for their drug use. We have tried shaming addicts. We have tried to restrict all forms of drug access to addicts. And historically, nothing has worked as much as treating them as normal human beings with some mental health issues that can be fixed using standard mental health procedures. Theoretically, Indian law is also sympathetic towards users and addicts, and it recommends very lightly, it recommends rehab and treatment over throwing people in jail. Despite the law slightly urging the masses to look at all forms of drug use with empathetic eyes, when they see popular news anchors and major Indian institutions refer to drug users as chedumal drug wale, that is going to drive their primary perception of drug users. That is going to define how they look at people who aren't celebrities but are still addicts or users. If you look at major anchors refer to celebrity drug users with disgusting words, you're not going to look at your own addicted brother with eyes of empathy. You're going to look at him with eyes of moral superiority, as if you are somehow better, even though he gets more women. And without empathy, your addicted brother won't receive the sort of social support that's a prerequisite for any sort of rehab and treatment tour. A lot of people want to try drugs, and more power to them, but nobody wants to become an addict. Addiction isn't fun, and it isn't because of a moral failure. When you're doing the same drug thrice a day, you aren't doing it to derive any more pleasure out of it. At that point, your body is basically biologically dependent on it, and you're just doing it to feel normal at that point. In some cases, you're doing it so that you don't die. Treating addicts as criminals will just make sure that they do not return to normalcy. Treating addicts as criminals will just make sure that the communities that they belong to, very largely marginalized and poor communities, it will make sure that these communities get further hatred thrown on them. Treating addicts as criminals will make sure that their own caretakers despise them and fail to provide the social or moral support required for rehab to happen. Looking at drug users and addicts as somehow morally inferior to us normal people is the kind of attitude that led to reefer madness in America in the 30s. It's the exact attitude that led to so many panic attacks of poor old Arnab Goswami on live TV. Instead of feeling this fake sense of moral superiority about not being fun at parties, it would be much more important and much more effective to understand how addiction works, understand how rehab works, understand how empathy can help in the process, and understand that while people are still not seeking treatment, still not seeking rehab, is there something that could be done to reduce the harm that their drug use does to them? Hey everyone, this is Satvik's unpaid editor, Satvik. And I had to make two clarifications that I think the video doesn't do a very good job of. The terms dependence and addiction should not be understood interchangeably. There's a considerable difference between the two. If you face withdrawal effects when you stop using a substance, you are dependent on it. So for example, if you are a heavy caffeine user and maybe drink like 5 to 6 cups of coffee every day, if you suddenly go cold turkey and do not take any more coffee, you will experience withdrawal symptoms such as mild headaches or feeling jittery, and that would be a sign of your dependence on caffeine. Addiction, on the other hand, is a chronic brain disease that happens because of a bunch of factors that Satvik has discussed in the video. They can include social pressures, past experiences, biological dependence, etc. You can be dependent on a substance without being addicted to it. This misunderstanding has had some terrible legal consequences as well. Refer to chapter 5 of Cannabis Indica by Dr. Gautam, who also is in this video. Number 2 is when Satvik uses the phrase weed or heroin or cigarettes, he isn't clubbing them together as things that have the same effect. It's more of a phrase that's used to indicate the range of addiction, and it could have just as easily included stuff like Instagram or running. I think it's pretty common knowledge by this point that you can't quit addiction just with a snap of your fingers. I can quit whenever I want is a lie that you keep telling yourself and your girlfriends, but the practical reality of overcoming an addiction is much more time consuming, much more messier. Addiction is biopsychosocial. The worst part about addiction is that its effects aren't limited to one particular aspect that can be isolated in a person's life. When you get into weed or heroin or cigarettes, you tend to develop a community around you that's equally into the same stuff. This community can be online or offline. For example, this is a post from a subreddit dedicated to cocaine enjoyers, and this is an actual comment on that post. And outside of doing drugs together, you also come to depend on this group for basic social support. So the act of quitting also comes with the harder task of leaving behind this group that you've grown so accustomed to and that you're now a part of. As a result, the journey is often too lonely for most people. And of course, the people you hang out with also impact your state of mind. Once you're deep into cigarettes, weed, or heroin, you develop psychological habits that keep you hooked to the substance. So weed particularly does not really create a lot of biological dependence, but it sure as hell creates a lot of psychological dependence. You can get into the habit of having a smoke break while at work. You can get into the habit of snorting cocaine before you go to work. And you can get into the habit of having a tall glass of whiskey when you come back from work. Leaving the substance behind often comes with the hard task of leaving behind these old habits and then replacing them with new ones. If you've ever tried to go on a run but given up after the first day, if you've ever tried to take up the guitar and given up after like a week of coaching, if you've ever tried to write a novel but then couldn't keep up the writing practice, then you know how difficult it could be to either create a new habit or give up on the old ones. Now multiply that by 100 times, because you might try to go running, you might fail, but you aren't biologically addicted to not running. Once you're deep into something like cigarettes, weed, or heroin, you don't just continue because you have bad morals or bad habits or bad friends. Of course, there are also biological components to it. To begin with, addiction is often genetic, as has been shown by the Lumineers in their amazing album titled 3. When you see an addict, there's almost always some form of family history also playing a role there. And then in addition to it, once you start using substances, they literally change your brain. So for example, continued substance abuse has been shown to damage your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain associated with decision making, logical thinking, controlling your impulses, basically everything that's stopping you from taking the next shot of vodka. Don't get me wrong here. Of course, the best possible outcome would be for the addict to leave that substance behind and never touch that stuff again. But it's not exactly possible, is it? The more practical reality is that people will continue to struggle with addiction. And while people struggle to quit, the best that the rest of society can do is a little something called harm reduction. Ever since we gained consciousness as a species, we have been getting drunk and high. Humans became aware of their existence on a Thursday evening, and by Friday afternoon they were done with this shit. We just wanted to go back to our fishy fish roots, and we invented booze for that. And we have tried arresting drug users, we have tried killing drug users, we have tried shaming drug users. The fact remains that humans will get drunk and humans will get high. And harm reduction is a philosophy that seeks to work with this underlying fact instead of in a very weird moralist way glossing over it. In a sense, this entire video so far has been based and rooted in the principles of harm reduction. These principles include respecting the basic human rights of drug users, coming up with intervention and rehabilitation strategies and programs that are backed by evidence and can help people get out of their addictions. They ask for people who are actual drug users to be involved in policies surrounding drug use, and finally making sure that drug users do not face any sort of stigma when it comes to seeking rehab. The entire shit show that Arnab and his gang put up, therefore, was entirely against the principles of this global movement of harm reduction. And it's not just them. I mean, India as a whole scores pretty terribly on harm reduction. So there's this global policy index that keeps a track of how countries are scoring when it comes to their policies around drug use and drug-related crimes. And looking at India, guys, it's not poggers. So for example, the law that we have around drugs does manage to mention harm reduction, but then the funding for that harm reduction gets India a score of 1 out of 100. When it comes to punishing drug criminals whose crimes were not violent, India scores a whopping 25 out of 100. Overall, India scores 46 out of 100. The index was last created before the Taliban took over, and Afghanistan scored 49. Kyrgyzstan scored 50 out of 100. I did not even know that it was a country. I'm not sure right now. And these aren't just numbers. All of these statistics hide real costs. Indian lives are at stake here. When Indian drug users realize that there are no reliable de-addiction rehabilitation centers that they could safely seek out, and then when they see extremely powerful people calling them chedumal drug wale on national TV, it doesn't really inspire them to quit drugs. They deserve access to better rehab networks. They deserve clean new syringes so that they do not end up killing themselves. They deserve to be able to go to a rehab center without the fear of being ostracized by their community or worst, being arrested. The title of this video promises a better way of looking at drug users, something better than what has been provided in mainstream media as of late. And the most important shift in outlook that we can have right now is looking at drug users with empathy, realizing that that could have been us, our children, or our brothers, and making sure that we do not feel morally superior to them and that it's easier for addicts to reintegrate into society, all of which are principles of harm reduction, by the way. These are all crucial, they can't be overlooked. Now, in addition to adopting an empathetic outlook towards addiction, we also need to have an honest, critical conversation around legalization. Are our laws around legalization fair? Are they some form of a colonial legacy? Why is weed still illegal when every one of your friends is doing it? So this is the NDPS Act of 1985, and these are the rules that India is supposed to follow when it comes to our drug policy. As I mentioned earlier, in theory the law is sympathetic towards addicts and does not treat them as criminals, instead treating them as patients of mental health. According to the NDPS Act, the central government is tasked with the identification, treatment, education, aftercare, rehab, and social integration of addicts. It talks of creating a fund using donations and the money seized from drug traffickers, and one of the primary functions of this fund is supposed to be rehabilitation, re-education, and the reintegration of addicts into society, and even providing them with the drugs that they need to stay alive. When addicts get arrested, the law even allows for them to be sent to rehab for up to an year instead of being thrown into prison directly. It doesn't specifically ask for people to be sent to rehab. It's just an option. And in fact, if an addict is voluntarily seeking de-addiction, the act even provides them immunity from being arrested for small possession of drugs. And guess what? Cannabis is the most widely consumed drug out there. Also, according to the NDPS, consumers can be treated sympathetically, but it's not necessary. And consumption also falls under illicit traffic, which is, punishable. And I don't know about you, but unless the law requires me to treat someone with basic human decency, I kill their parents. And so I understand how authorities take it that way as well. The result is that consumers are arrested a lot. Just last year, 33,000 people were arrested for personal use as opposed to 26,000 for trafficking. And cannabis is the most consumed drug. There's also the issue of going after poor people, because there always is. According to Vidhi, which is a legal think tank, almost everyone arrested in Mumbai for consumption of drugs was consuming cannabis, first of all, and almost everyone arrested for consumption was a daily wage earner. These people cannot afford to contest their accusations in court. And therefore, this provides a very cheap way to signal that work is being done by swelling up our statistics when actually nothing is changing on the ground. The law is sort of the final frontier that I wanted to discuss when it comes to drugs. And luckily, I found this little book called Cannabis Indica that discusses the legal status around morphine. And it would have been great, except that I do not know how to read. So I ended up contacting the author of this book. And
the practice of consumption of bhang, which is consumed on, for instance, Holi festival, etc., that's legal in India. So the restriction is really to ganja and charas. Now that restriction isn't also made out on anything scientific because the psychoactive element in all these three is the same. There's delta 9 THC. So basically in India, delta 9 THC could be consumed by way of edibles recreationally, but it can't be smoked. That's a very strange position to be in.
That's Dr. Khagesh Gautam.
I teach law, I practice law, and I write about law. I attended law school in Delhi. I practiced law for about 4 years, 1 year in Delhi and rest of the time in Chandigarh. After that, I studied in Columbia, obtained my LLM, and I recently, last year, finished my doctoral work from Indiana University.
So as I mentioned earlier, I reached out to him to better understand the legal status of cannabis and to sort of cross-question him using the common questions that I have faced.
Okay, so what's your favorite strain? So you make a case for legalization in cannabis indica.
I do. The way I approach cannabis decriminalization studies in India is to focus only on cannabis and to effectively argue, one, that from a legal standpoint, it seems the case to include cannabis in the NDPS Act is extremely weak. As I've said in the book, and I'm willing to say that again, there seems to, to my legal mind, there is neither a cause nor a case to have cannabis covered by the NDPS Act. So immediately, broadly, take cannabis out, immediately, small quantities possession decriminalization. The possession of a small quantity of cannabis, perhaps even an ounce or 2 ounces. 1 ounce is approximately 28 grams, if I recall correctly. So that's about 40-50 grams of cannabis we're talking about. If I give a historical reference to the IHDC Commission report, that's Indian Hemp Drugs Commission. In 1894, they gave the report. I discussed that in chapter 2 of the book. According to that report, 60 grams is the quantity that we may consider to decriminalize. I think the possession of a small quantity of cannabis clearly intended for personal consumption should be decriminalized in our country. And I think the best way to go about it is to bring about necessary amendments in the NDPS Act.
When I asked my dadi about legalization of cannabis, she said that it would lead to a lot of ill effects on society. So I asked Khagesh about his views on the matter.
Depends on how you define the phrase ill effect.
So are there, there are gateway drug theories, for example?
Addiction risk.
Yeah.
I think the point of addiction risk is very valid. I think the gateway drug theory has now been thoroughly debunked. I've discussed that in the book, so I won't waste any time of the listeners. Suffice it to say that the gateway drug theory has been so thoroughly debunked that just saying that is good enough. There's no need to waste time on that. I don't think cannabis is a gateway drug. I don't think cannabis at any point of time was a gateway drug. I think the experiences of people who have consumed cannabis for a very long period of time, I have collected at least 2 survey reports where the surveyors questioned through a questionnaire people who had consumed cannabis for a span of over 10 to 15 years regularly. And the survey results are very interesting. The people who consumed cannabis for a period of 10 to 15 years regularly, these are surveys coming out of New Zealand and Canada and Australia, they had no criminal self-perception. People who are cultivating and consuming cannabis regularly for 10 to 15 years don't think they are criminals. People who are living with them, their spouses, their kids, their friends, they don't think that these people are criminals. And these people have been able to maintain steady relationships, steady jobs, they are paying their taxes, they are responsible and law-abiding members of their society, good people of their community, and the people, their neighbors don't have any problems with them. These are the survey findings of survey reports where all respondents are people who have consumed cannabis for over 10 to 15 years. And they have been doing this in the, flying in the face of the law.
The gateway drug theory just says that once you start doing a substance, you become more likely to start doing worse substances. Around cannabis, it usually goes that once you get into cannabis, you are involved in that entire drug scene, so you are then more likely to smoke meth, snort coke, It has been widely criticized. It has been widely, rejected, as Khagesh just stated. Wouldn't legalization make cannabis much more widely available? And once it is widely available, wouldn't it lead to a lot of people experimenting with it?
The apprehension is not based on anything solid for the following reason. A, cannabis is widely available. If the position is that, let's say we decriminalize cannabis and we allow it to be sold commercially for recreational purposes even. So now cannabis is available on a liquor store. We have liquor stores across the nation. We can have a small segment, a small shelf there where producers can display their ganja and people can buy them. So let's say in a world like that, where things like that have come, or perhaps like the US, you can go online, you can show your identification certificates, whatever, and you can have it shipped to your house. Let's say hypothetically that India, that thing has happened in India. Will the consumption patterns suddenly go up? I don't think so. Because ganja is widely available now, cannabis is widely available, it is being consumed widely. The government's own numbers support that. I have run 3 surveys with my students and our surveys support that. Vidhi and some other legal think tanks are doing work on this and their research supports that. So where is the evidence that ganja, if it legalized, suddenly will result in increased consumption patterns? That didn't happen in Colorado. That didn't happen in Michigan. That didn't happen anywhere. Second, there is evidence though in some jurisdictions in the US that there was a small period immediately following decriminalization or legalization where consumption patterns did go up, but then they subsided almost immediately. This is very important for us to note. It is like if somebody is consuming cannabis recreationally before it is legalized and suddenly it is legal, it is but natural for them in that state of excitement and euphoria to order more cannabis, but what happens is that almost always goes down. Third, most importantly, teenage consumption didn't go up, and that's the most promising statistic. In all the jurisdictions where it was legalized, teenage consumption didn't go up, violent crimes didn't go up, productivity didn't suddenly come down. It wasn't as if youth was on the sides of the streets smoking weed, not doing anything. Nothing of that sort happened. In fact, most kids who were teenage kids, they went about their business by and large the same way. So it is very valid to say that the teenage youth is exposed to it, and the teenage youth could get addicted to it, and there are health, there could be, like for example, driving under influence instances could be there, or people, that's very valid. Those are valid concerns. But experimentally, wherever this experiment was undertaken, that actually didn't happen on ground. So that's a good result for us.
Do you remember the earlier study from Vidhi, the think tank, that stated that a lot of people arrested for consumption were just daily wage earners? Khagesh has an interesting perspective using the same study, and something that I had not considered till now. Yeah, a few poor people are being arrested. That's, that's sad or whatever. Just get over it. But it's also extremely costly for our legal machinery to do that.
According to that study, an overwhelming proportion of charges that were brought in Bombay courts regarding cannabis under NDPS Act were cannabis possession charges, small quantity possession charges. In USA, it has been documented so overwhelmingly that there is almost no need to cite evidence now, but it is a fact that small quantities possession represented a nightmare for American criminal justice law enforcement. It presents the exact same nightmare for Indian criminal justice law enforcement. The police are overburdened. Sometimes an investigation officer has to investigate more than 40 to 50 cases at one point of time. Imagine yourself investigating 40 cases at one point of time. It is back-breaking work. We should be compassionate to our police also. They are also human beings. So they also need to be given much relief from this stress of pendency that they are constantly in. And our criminal justice system, the courts. The courts are also buried under these cases, and of course more is written about the court's pendency than the police pressure. I think we need to take efforts to reduce stress on our police and our criminal courts. by removing from the ambit of what is considered a crime all these things that I mentioned: consumption, possession, and cultivation. I think they should all be decriminalized, and this is an additional benefit to the police and to the courts. The idea of criminalizing addiction, and I think the idea of declaring consumption of cannabis itself a crime, and the idea of declaring an addict themselves as a criminal, I think represents a very unenlightened, backward looking, now proven to be unworkable, now proven to be inhumane approach that our NDPS Act is still adhering to. And I think this work, that's very important. I think one of the key things that this work has pointed out is that you can't criminalize possession, you can't criminalize consumption. And in the case of I mean, if there is a case that a person has fallen an addict, for example, in the case of opium, if somebody has become addicted to opium to such an extent that they are causing harm now, or they are at risk, they can be taken to a de-addiction center, but then you have to treat them the de-addiction has to be a process that doesn't treat the addict as a criminal, that doesn't treat the addict as a moral failure. But right now our approach is to treat the addict as if they have committed some great moral failure and a sin from which they have to be redeemed, as it were. The modern day idea of addiction, which is based on behaviors. Addiction is a behavior that people engage into essentially to soothe pain. And pain has diverse causes. Somebody could be in pain because of a physical ailment. Another person could be in pain because of a psychological ailment. Body doesn't distinguish. The mind doesn't distinguish between the two types of pain. A person who is experiencing pain on account of, say, for example, post-traumatic stress or depression, the body will understand that pain as the same pain which the body experiences on account of a physical affliction. And so therefore, if THC, I'm referring to because that's the compound that has been isolated, but generally speaking, if THC heavy or THC dominant strains of cannabis are available, which can be taken by people and which result in their pain being diminished, then I think we should take a second look at the laws that we have, because I believe if we declare a person consuming cannabis to be an addict, a criminal, somebody who has committed a great moral sin and who needs reformation, then I think we are making a grave error if we accept that in principle to be a good approach, a approach that can be followed. Then one day we could perhaps on the same principle treat a person who regularly needs insulin, a diabetic, also as a criminal. Because we can't say that a person who's consuming insulin regularly, a diabetic, the same reason why a diabetic can't be called a criminal is the same reason why a person who's consuming medicinal cannabis can't be called a criminal. And I think this is a very fundamental error in our law that we need to remove right now.
So Arnab was wrong about cannabis use.
Well, I'll leave that to Mr. Goswami.
chedumal drug wale